have no eloquent skills. Also, the Quran could not have come from the Prophet ﷺ because we know that if we study psycholinguistics and psychology, the brother's still laughing. If we study psycholinguistics and psychology, we would understand that when someone writes something, some of his personality is in the material. When you go to Shakespeare, just if you do grounded theory or discourse analysis or qualitative analysis, you know it came from someone like Shakespeare. He's a product of that environment. If you go to Homer's work, the Greek guy, you know it came from Homer. Any work, and you put it under the scrutiny of psycholinguistics, you know roughly who it came from. But when we do psycholinguistics to the Quran, we don't know who it's from. It's in the divine voice. And it's made even worse because we know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he had an emotional roller coaster for 23 years. His children died at birth. His beloved wife passed away. His uncle passed away. He was tortured, abused, boycotted. He was stoned in a town in Arabia where the blood was running down his legs and his sandals were stuck to the sand. A day that he called his hardest day. He went through all this emotional roller coaster. He was boycotted from his beloved city. But none of this emotion is in the Quran itself. This is a psycholinguistic impossibility, brothers and sisters and friends. Also, we know the Quran is a literary masterpiece. And like literary masterpieces, or generally literary masterpieces, they don't get revealed instantaneously. They need some work. You see some old revisions of Romeo and Juliet, or some old revisions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, etc., etc. But the Quran was revealed instantaneously, kept its peak as a literary masterpiece, and there was no revisions. This again desculpts our understanding of literary masterpieces. Also, we know the prophetic traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, are antithetical in style to the Quranic discourse, to the point where one Egyptian scholar, he would put on the board prophetic statements, hadith, and Quranic verses. He would jumble them together, and everybody would understand which one was Quran and which was prophetic tradition. Because there is a distinctness there. Also, we know it could have come from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ because all types of human expression. Look at this art piece of... Who is that?
Previous Vice Chancellor.
The Vice Chancellor, yeah? And over there I think it's Mr... the far end, the guy who won the war. Churchill, that's it. Sorry. Those art pieces are an expression of human activity. I would ask you, can we emulate that style? That's probably unique to the artist. Of course we can. You know why? We have the blueprint. In human expression, when we have the blueprint to something, we can always emulate it. That's why some people have accused Christopher Marlowe, the contemporary of Shakespeare, of developing some of Shakespeare's works. Because you can't emulate human expression if you have the blueprint. Well, we have the Quran today living for 1400 years. The blueprint of the Quran. But yet no one has been able to challenge it. And this again disculps our understanding of what it means to have human expression. Because if it was human expression, then surely we should be able to copy it because the blueprint exists. We know what the words are, we know the grammar, we know the sounds, but yet we can't emulate the Quran. So therefore, we can conclude it can't come from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So we said, we've got good reasons to believe it can't come from an Arab, good reasons to believe it can't come from a non-Arab, and good reasons to believe it can't come from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself. So who's next? Okay?
I say a group of people.
Sorry?
I say a group of people.
Same thing, we could apply to the first three scenarios. Is anyone Christian in this audience? Christian. Okay, good. So, I gave this presentation in Soares University, and one Christian apologist or missionary, he stood up and he said, it could be from the devil. I said, okay. Everyone starts to laugh. And I said, well, how do you know? Because your Quran says so. Also, you believe in Quran, do you? I was like, give you another chance. Why is it from the devil? Oh, because the devil exists. How do you know? Because the Bible told me. It's an unseen reality. You have to prove the Bible to me now. You have to prove the source of these things. So when we say it's Jibreel alayhi salam, how do we know? Where do we get the concept of the angel from? Quran. So you have to believe in Quran first before you even announce that the angel Gabriel can be a source for the Quran. So it's a circular argument. It's a defeating argument. It's a self-defeating argument. So now we can conclude it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It came from the divine. Because we've exhausted all naturalistic explanations. We haven't even used one verse of the Arabic language. We've just taken logical deduction, which is taking a universally accepted statement and drawing logical conclusions. So you don't have to be an Arabist to appreciate that it is really from the divine. So, let's go to the second aspect of the miracle of the Quran, which is a historical phenomenon. Now the Quran mentions many things about history. It uses history for us to reflect upon the future. It takes history, its lessons, the relevant aspects of history, and says, look, think about your future. Don't repeat the same mistakes. Learn from the mistakes of the past. This is what the Quran does. But also the Quran mentions some minute details as well that some people may think is irrelevant. For instance, the Quran in two different places, or in many places, but specifically two, mentions the leader of the Egyptians. We've been mentioning Egyptians a lot today, haven't we? Egyptian scholars, Mubarak, political realities. Okay? Egyptians. The leader of the Egyptians is mentioned in two types of descriptions. Malik, the king, and Pharaoh, the pharaoh. The question is, why does the Quran use two different titles for the leader of the Egyptians? And there are two different times. The pharaoh is for Moses alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, and the king, Malik, is for Yusuf alayhi salam. You can see this in the 12th chapter of the Quran. Why is this happening? People used to accuse the Quran of being incorrect because the Bible only mentioned Pharaoh. So what's going on here? Well, we know if we go to history, as a result of translating hieroglyphics, having the Rosetta Stone, we come to the conclusion that actually there were two types of labels and titles for the leader of pharaohs. He was only called Pharaoh at a particular point in time, which included the time of Moses. If you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, you find this very basic information. And when you go to the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, the Pharaoh was not called Pharaoh at that time, he was called Malik, the king. Such a minute, historical, accurate description the Quran has given. And this really kills the idea of the borrowing theory. The Prophet borrowed and took from the Bible and the Torah. How can that be? How can that be? That means he took things from the Bible, knew what was wrong, and corrected it. That would assume that he had a library of Alexandrian magnitude. So how could he have known such minute historical information? In light of this, brothers and sisters, how could the Prophet ﷺ have known such minute historical detail, especially when all other religious texts and historical texts available at the time did not discuss this? And since people at the time of Revelation did not know this information, but it's included in the Quran, what does it tell you about the author? Something to think about. The final aspect of the Quranic miracle is the scientific aspect. I don't like to call it scientific because it assumes science is the yardstick. It assumes empiricism is the only methodology to come to conclusions about man and life in the universe. I disagree. Empiricism is very crude. It deals with certain realities. It can't deal with, for example, realities of politics, of morality. It can't deal with things like even proving mathematical truths, like logic. Because you need logic before you have science. And to try and prove science trying to prove logic using science, we'll be arguing in a circle. So it's a limited methodology here. So when I mean scientific, I mean natural phenomena. Things we know to be 100% accurate. For instance, the Quran mentions the function and structure of mountains. The Quran says in 2 places, we placed firmly embedded mountains in the earth so it would not move under them. And in another place it says, have we not made the earth as a bed and the mountains as its pegs, like having stake-like structures? Now we have only recently understood this in the past few years, in the late 20th century. For instance, we have just found out, if you read the book by Dr. Frank Press called Earth, it discusses, a geology book, it discusses that mountains have peg, root, stake-like structures that are embedded in the earth. To the point they're about 7 to 15 times the height of the mountain above the earth. They're very long. And this is mentioned in geology books. For instance, the book by Dr. Frank Press called The Earth. Also, if we try to find out what the function of these roots are, the geologists call it isostasis, which means it firmly holds the earth together so there won't be excessive shocks. We know there's earthquakes, but it would prevent further shocks. This is modern day geology, based upon modern day technology. How can we have an illiterate man? And we know the Prophet ﷺ was illiterate. Even if you go to the Orientalists, go to Richard Bell, he said, it is well known that the Prophet was illiterate. He came from an ummi, from an illiterate people. So how can we say this man was just a normal human being? Or rather his revelation was just normal. His revelation cannot be human, because it de-scoped human knowledge and technology at the time. So in this light, and in the fact of this scientific phenomenon in the Quran, and there's many others, which is relatively recent science, with no one at the time of revelation knowing, or even having the technology to know, what does this tell you about the author? So we can conclude, brothers and sisters, that the Quran is indeed a miracle from a linguistic, historical and scientific perspective, because it de-scoped the nature of the particular event or the particular miracles we're talking about. With regards to language, we go to the Arabic language, we exhaust all logical possibilities of the Arabic language, the finite grammatical rules, the 28 letters, and we can't produce Quran. We go to history, we go to the history at the time, we exhaust all possible historical knowledge, it didn't exist, so how can the Prophet ﷺ have put that into the Quran? With regards to the historical knowledge, we mentioned about the Pharaoh and the king, the description of the Egyptian leaders. And finally, when we go to the nature of scientific knowledge at the time and the available technology, we don't have it. So we exhaust the logical, naturalistic explanations, we can't find one, so it's a signpost to the transcendent, it's a signpost to the divine. I've got a few minutes left, and I just want to add that the Quran is not just a book, as we mentioned in the beginning, that evokes thought. It talks about spirituality. It really engages with the human psyche. It deals with arrogance. It deals with the human being. As a human being, it's very existential from that perspective. But it also has tremendously changed history as we know it. Let's take, for example, how the Quran manifested kindness and liberty in history. And the reason I'm mentioning history is because now, as we can see with the Egyptians today, they're full of dictators, despots, and tyrannical rulers that don't implement the values of their tradition. But in history, more or less they did. Kindness and liberty. The Quran says, there is no compulsion in religion, vary the right path has become distinct from the wrong path. The Quran also says, what will explain to you what the steep path is? It is to free a slave, to feed in a time of hunger, an orphan relative or a poor person in distress, and to be one of those who believe and urge one another to steadfastness and compassion. And what does the history have to tell us?